So in the spring of 1917, Indiana University was approved as one of the first round of schools that were given Army instructors through the ROTC program. However, it would be a while before that instructor would get to here. So it turned out that one of our faculty members, an assistant professor named K.P. Williams, who's now known as the father of ROTC, decided he would take on the task of trying to organize and train and get students ready to go for when that military science instructor got here. So K.P. Williams was a lieutenant at that point in the National Guard, had served in the Mexican Border War, and took on this challenge of also organizing and running the military science program. His assistant with getting this program started was a young graduate student who was also a lieutenant in the National Guard named Louis B. Hershey. Louis B. Hershey would go on to have a very long career in the military. In fact, Hershey left after the first year that he was here in graduate school so that he could go active duty and serve in the military during World War I. By World War II, he was in charge of the Selective Service Program, aka the draft. A role that he would go on and continue to have all the way through the 1970s when he finally retired from the Army at the age of 79 as a 4-star general. We had also given him an honorary doctorate by that point. And so, this future 4-star general was one of the graduate students that was helping start the program back in 1917. As the program got started in 1917, by the fall of 1918, the war had come to campus and many things had been taken over, and Indiana University actually became more of a military base and a military training depot, which kind of eclipsed some of the ROTC with a program called SATC. The SATC program was wildly popular. Most of the male students at IU signed up for it and were in it. In fact, it was so popular that the Army couldn't provide enough barracks. And so what they did is they converted a lot of fraternity houses into being barracks in order to meet this demand of being able to house all of these new soldiers that had joined. One of the interesting things is this was very hastily done. Nobody sort of paid attention. And when IU said, we're opening it up to all freshmen and sophomore men, nobody bothered to realize that the university, on the Army side, seems to have realized that the university was racially integrated. And so we allowed African Americans to join, even though they would not at that point be allowed to be commissioned officers in the Army. The Army wouldn't commission African Americans through this program, and we let them be a part of it. And there's some interesting correspondence back and forth, and there's a whole other video about some of the challenges that went along with that. From the very beginning, ROTC programs through about the late 1950s, early 1960s, often had branches, as we know them in the military, that were a piece of them. So IU had a medical ROTC, we had an infantry ROTC, a logistics ROTC. We had different units within our ROTC regiment that were a part of that. We even had an armor unit briefly during World War I, and this is actually an Armistice Day parade with them driving a tank down Kirkwood Avenue as part of the Armistice Day parade. So you can imagine what it would be like if a tank drove down Kirkwood Avenue today as part of a parade. That was a perfectly normal thing in the World War I era, apparently. And as I mentioned a second ago, ROTC was a regiment because every male freshman and sophomore was required to take it. From 1917, 1918, all the way through the 1960s, every male freshman and sophomore was required to take it, including the African Americans, which became a challenge in that the opportunities for them to go on into the junior and senior levels and earn a commission was very limited. And so that became part of the early pushback about how this program was organized. Again, IU historically basing the military concepts on our university and not on the practicalities or the actualities of the military, allowed women to participate in the ROTC program, which created a number of interesting things, problems with getting uniforms or trying to standardize those uniforms and some of those sort of things that the Army hadn't really thought through. The Army had allowed women during World War I, and the military in general had allowed women during World War I very limited roles, and didn't in the peacetime military only allowed them as nurses. And so this became part of the challenge of IU going, but we have students and we want to let all of our students participate. This idea of allowing women to participate and having women in uniform would have a long-term effect on the institution that we'll talk a little bit more about later on. But what it meant was that women in uniform were no stranger on our campus. And by the time of World War II, they actually had their own women's auxiliary unit, similar to the auxiliary units that served during World War II, such as the Waves and the WWII and those groups. It was also right after World War I that the fledgling marching band for the university became the regimental band for Army ROTC. And the marching 100 became a thing because of those uniforms and the materials and the things that were able to be provided to the band via the Army. In these interwar years, one of the other challenges that ROTC faced was that with the rise of the Klan in Indiana, enrollment in African Americans, particularly male African Americans, declined significantly, and there were a lot of challenges and pushback against them serving in ROTC. There's this larger issue of African Americans in the military in general that's sort of happening. And so when Herman Wells became president, one of his challenges became reintegrating ROTC. And interestingly enough, some of the families, the children of their fathers having served in IU Army ROTC during World War I, became the people who were reintegrating ROTC in the late 1930s, early 1940s, when they're making an effort to reintegrate the program. ROTC often gets overlooked during the war because, again, during World War II, we became a military training site, and you get this all this military folks, particularly the Navy, that comes to campus. ROTC still existed during the war. It was just a much smaller scale program than it was before that. But when I say smaller scale, I simply mean that less students were attending the university. All male freshmen and sophomores were still required to be in ROTC. So this is a World War II homecoming picture. So this is our homecoming football game in World War II. You can see in the picture that we have large groups of Navy folks that are there in the middle. And I'm not sure if the program on the far side or the near side is ROTC. The other is something called ASTP, the Army Specialized Training Program. And that's folks that the Army was sending here to get training from IU during the war. But this still gives you a perspective of how militarized the campus was during World War II. It was also during World War II that some of the Army ROTC cadets began asking for an Army Air Corps unit and making attempts at getting pilot training here in Bloomington or through the Army Air Corps. And as you look at the tires on this plane, you can see one of the challenges was that we had a dirt airfield, which was not usable during certain times of the year, which made pilot training really difficult and is part of the reason we were not able to secure a Air Corps training unit until after World War II. When we finally did secure a Army Air Corps training unit, it had by that point become the Air Force and was its own separate group. And in 1951, we had our first graduates of Air Force ROTC, although there had been some Air Corps officers that had graduated before that. Air Force ROTC got their own blue uniforms, became their own organization in 1951. And one of those first graduates of that program was an Air Force veteran of World War II who would go on to become a brigadier general. And that's Brigadier General Norris Overton, who's pictured here on the left. After World War II, ROTC went back to being the ROTC program and training folks. Now, you also have to understand that commissions-wise, all the way up through World War II, getting commissioned as a reserve officer was more like what today we would call the individual ready reserve. It basically meant if you got drafted, you would be drafted as a second lieutenant. It didn't necessarily have the active duty National Guard sort of pieces that we think of today. In fact, the idea that graduating and commissioning means you're going to serve is really not something that came about until the 70s, 80s timeframe when we switched to a volunteer force. Before that, it wasn't uncommon for folks to get commissioned and then not serve other than in a reserve officer on call if needed capacity. When the university was making an attempt to recruit more African-American faculty members, a lot of universities were, and it was difficult to sort of find folks and get them recruited. And Army ROTC stepped up and said, hey, you know what, we can help you with that. We can actually get an African-American ROTC faculty member. And so Major Miller became the second African-American faculty member at IU because of the work of ROTC to help out with the university's goals. So as the 1960s went on, much like in other parts of the country on other college campuses, protests began to develop over the Vietnam War. And with ROTC being the most visible presence of the military on campus, ROTC began to take a lot of the heat and a lot of the anger and issues that were kind of going on at the national level. ROTC on campus really became the focus of that. And this was true on a lot of campuses across America. This wasn't uniquely an IU problem in that sense. So oftentimes, those protests get contributed as being the end of ROTC, and that's not entirely true. So in 1964, something called the ROTC Revitalization Act was passed by Congress. And basically what it did is they said, hey, we don't need all these reserve officers. We don't need, Army can't keep funding training on all these campuses for all these really large units. And they actually, in 1964, started moving towards voluntary ROTC at the national level. Now, at the same time, there had already been some criticism of compulsory programs, and they weren't particularly popular. And so that aspect was already starting. Army was looking at changing that. Congress sort of passed that through with the Revitalization Act to make that happen. The other piece that had happened is there was some pushback about the curriculum of ROTC, because at this point, ROTC instructors were very much just selected by the Army and sent there. Their level of quality as an instructor could vary quite a bit. Their level of education could vary quite a bit. Officers were not required to have graduate degrees at this point still, or not encouraged to have advanced degrees, or even college degrees in some cases. So that really pushed to this change, this Revitalization Act that went in 1964. And along with that, Army said, we don't want compulsory programs anymore. And so in 1965, IU ended its compulsory ROTC program, no longer requiring freshmen and sophomore men to participate. So that's where we're going to leave off with part 2 of our history of ROTC. I realize that was really long. I just tried to cram 50 years of programming, really diverse and dynamic programming with lots of changes into it. I didn't even mention the rifle teams, the national caliber rifle teams that came out of ROTC, or the women's rifle team, which is one of our first intercollegiate competitive teams. There's lots of other things I didn't get to. We'll have to put those in other episodes, but I'm already way over time for this week, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up, and hopefully you'll stay tuned for part 3, which is 1965 onward in ROTC history, military science, and aerospace studies history here at IU. Make sure to subscribe. I'm going to throw up a link to the part 1 video in case you missed it, and we will see you next week.